Hello, everybody. I'm excited to bring to you this conversation I had with Kevin Gray, my best friend, over in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Some of you met Kevin last year when he was in town. He and his wife Allison came to our church on 2 Sundays and we shared music together. But I met Kevin back in 1994 when we were both students at Winthrop University. As a matter of fact, before I met Kevin, I was in a composition lesson with my composition teacher, Dr. Lauren Whiteman, and she began telling me about this prospective student who they were hoping to get to Winthrop and how talented he was and how much music he had written. And lo and behold, Kevin Gray came to Winthrop and we met. What is your recollection, Kevin?
Well, I had a similar recollection in that when I was auditioning for ensembles, the first person that I met was Dr. Robert Edgerton, who both of our choir directors. He said at the end of the audition, he said, "So nice to meet you. There's a guy that you need to meet. His name is Michael Miller." I went, "Oh, that's great. I can't wait to meet this guy." Then I went to an audition with a voice teacher, Jerry Helton, who taught both of us voice. And at the end of that audition, he said, "There's this guy that you need to meet. You guys would really get along. His name is Mike Miller." And I said, "Well, that's the second time I've heard that today." So I made my way into the newly renovated music building, and I can remember like it was yesterday. As soon as you go in that door to the side entrance, immediately to the left, there's a break room there. And the first person I meet coming out of the break room was you, Mike Miller. And so I said, "This is my name is Kevin Gray." And you said, "Well, my name is Mike Miller." And I said, "Well, I'm supposed to meet you." And you said, "Well, I'm supposed to meet you too." And so 26 years later, we're still talking almost every day and enjoying each other's company.
Yeah. Well, I also remember after some time, I recalled that in the year prior to that, I sat behind you and your then girlfriend Olivia at
Mm-hmm.
the Opera La Serva at
Yeah,
Winthrop, and y'all were literally in the seats right in front of me. And so
great small world.
I know, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that we were destined to be friends. And I
Absolutely.
consider your friendship one of the greatest blessings in my life.
Same here.
Kevin and I have had very similar life journeys when it comes to music. We both grew up in South Carolina. We both grew up in the church. We both ended up at Winthrop. We both became choral conductors in schools and in community choirs, but we both felt a calling into church music ministry. And so uh, it's nice to have somebody who's walking this journey that I am walking, even though we're 3,000 miles apart. But I have several questions I want to ask Kevin pertaining
Okay.
to what we do in our calling as church music ministers. What is the first musical experience you can recall?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't remember my life before music. It has been something that has always permeated my life. Probably that's because I was reared in church. So my earliest musical experience, probably like your own, was hearing music in church. But I say my journey really began probably when I was 4 and a half. I decided that I wanted to learn how to play the piano like the people at church. And I lived next door to my grandmother and was there all the time. And she had a piano left over from when my aunt had taken piano. And I said, "I want to take piano." And so my grandparents took me to a piano teacher. She looked at my hands and she said, "Oh, he's too young. His hands are too small. Bring him back in a year or two. We don't usually start them that young." I did not like that answer at all. And so I went back to my grandmother's house, and my aunt had some. She had some music books. I think actually they were from another musical instrument, a keyboard instrument called the Fun Machine.
Oh, yeah.
People from the 70s might remember what that was, but I taught myself the first page or two from that.
Mhm.
I don't know how I did that, and that God must have been helping me because I wasn't that smart. But they took me to the piano teacher, and they said, "Watch what he can do." And so I played those first 2 pages with all my heart, with all the passion that I had. And the piano teacher said, "Well, you know what? I'll do it." So I started taking piano at about 4 and a half, and from that point on in my life, I think music has been one of the predominant leading forces to my journey. I'm thankful for it. Thankful for that old piano laying around.
Well, you and I both share the feeling that what we do is a calling, different from, those who say they have a church gig or they just work in a church. We both see what we do as a calling. We see that we are serving our congregations. But what is it about this that pulls you so strongly to it?
Well, sometimes people, when they refer to me as a musician, I will say, well, I'm not primarily a musician. I am a theologian. I am a philosopher. I am a servant of the Lord. And my mode of communication is music. I found a long time ago that music had something special to it that transcended just me speaking. I was very intrigued by that and had a gift in that. So when I am leading music, when I am writing music, when I'm directing music, playing music, there is a communication of those theological principles that I hold so dear in my heart, and I'm trying to communicate those to other people and have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the technical aspect of planning a worship service, what do you go through? What's your thought process?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that the human mind can only remember and comprehend so much. So you really have to have a theme. And so we usually get that theme from the scripture of the day. And in our church, about 85% of the time, we use the lectionary. And everything that we do in the worship service, it bolsters that theme. Whether it's the call to worship, the hymns, the anthem, as often as we can, we try to connect all of that together, because when the real work is really going to happen during the other 6 days of the week when people are reflecting back over what they witnessed on Sunday morning, and we want them to be able to remember it. The other thing in planning worship is you want the congregation to see themselves represented on the chancel. So my senior pastor and I, Dennis Faust, we have a worship grid, and we use that to remind us that in any given month or a few weeks that we need to make sure that we have young people leading worship, teenagers leading worship, children, senior citizens, 20-somethings, people in their 40s. We make sure there's a balance between male and female voices. Also the music, some of it's Reformation era hymns. Some of the hymns are from the 90s. The anthems range everywhere from Handel to gospel music, to world music. So that there's a great deal of variety there. I often joke and say that one day we're going to end up in heaven all together, and we're not just going to have one style of music, or one style of praying. We might as well go ahead and experiment a little bit, and sometimes that will push you out of your comfort zone, but that's okay. Growth. Every time I've grown, I've been a little bit uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So when you are planning these services, what do you hope the outcome is? What do you expect to see or feel from your congregation or from yourself, or what's that look like?
Really, I want them to experience God. And people experience God sometimes through the reading of the scripture. Sometimes people experience God through the singing or the sermon, or simply being together. At St. John's, we refer on Sunday morning as the church gathered. So we are gathering together to worship this God who has been so loving and good to us. We learn more attributes of God. And then as the scattered church, that's what we call ourselves when the benediction is proclaimed. We are then God's scattered church going out into the world to use all of that knowledge and all of that sense of love that we get from God to make the world more like God's kingdom.
Where do you see church music or church in general, or what do you hope to see in church or church music in the next 10 years or 10 years from now?
We're traditional service. We wear robes. We have a pipe organ. We sing hymns and anthems. We also sing all those other things too, even some contemporary praise music and things like that. So there's elements of the traditional that will always be there. Something that is set aside, that is different, The furniture looks different. The clothes we wear look a little bit different. And we combine that with the familiar so that we realize that, that God is also, we're all part of a family. And family love each other. And there's some familiarity there.
When we've talked before, and this might go back to part of the question about selecting music or worship elements, one of the things you and I talk about is the need for authenticity in worship. What do you think about
Absolutely.
that?
I think it has to be authentic. Um, Worship doesn't just happen in the mind. I have been in services before where it was beautiful, and from an intellectual standpoint, it was very challenging. But authenticity allows the soul to flourish,
Hmm.
and you have to use the voice that is your authentic self, and not try to be anything that you're not. We all have different experiences, and by using our authentic voice, we are sharing with other people the many different ways that God works through people and in people.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think music is so helpful in troubled times like those that we're in right now?
Well, I know that's a good question, Michael, because it is simple and profound all at the same time. That's how you know it's a good one. Well, I think with music, there's a lot tied up in how music makes you feel.
Mm-hmm.
We have memories attached to music, memories that remind us sometimes that we've been through hard times before, we have mourned before, we have been fearful before. But as we sung those hymns in the midst of that, here we are, we had good times. Now we're back into a time where we're a little bit fearful, but God will be faithful. There's also a lot of scientific evidence that suggests that music helps with anxiety. I was reading, I think it was in the Journal of Nursing, something of that nature, the other day, that said that senior citizens who listen to music on a regular basis are a lot less anxious and depressed.
Mm-hmm.
My wife, who was a yoga teacher for many years, mentioned to me the other day that she was reading an article that said that when we sing, we are regulating our breath and centering ourselves much in the way that yogic breathing during yoga. And music comes from a completely different place. Two very quick stories. I try not to speak quickly to get through them quickly because they're great stories. One was about 10 years ago at the church I used to serve, River Hills. I had a lady in my praise team, an incredible lady, just a wonderful soul. She had a severe stroke that left her unable to speak. And but what they found was that our speech is that we use to communicate like we're doing right now is a different part of the brain than the speech we use when we sing. So for part of her recovery, we found that she could still sing. And so I think about 2 months into her recovery, she got up on Sunday morning and I started to play the piano, and people did not know what was going to happen. And she started to sing, "Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder." And it was miraculous. Another story, I went to visit a friend of mine who was in a senior care home, and she was in her mid-90s and had gone downhill a lot. And I was warned when I went to visit her that she may not recognize me. But I put my hands on her shoulders and I said her name. I said, "This is Kevin. Remember me? I direct the music and lead the music at the church." And she could not really say anything to me, but this is what she did. She started humming those old hymns. And we ate dinner together, broke bread together. There was not a word that was shared from her. But the entire time, her brain was not working the way it had always worked. But her soul was still found a way to communicate, and that was through the musical part of her brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she let me know that she knew I was who I was and why I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Just miraculous.
Yeah. Well,
We are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Well, you're right about the memory or of the feelings we have attached to hymns, because oftentimes, as we've said before, I might not remember the hymns, all of the words, but I do remember standing in our pew in our home church and singing these songs and standing next to my mother, my brother, and my sister, and just that feeling of family and goodwill
Absolutely.
that is so closely associated with hymnody.
Mhm.
I also have a story similar to yours. A man, his name was Jack Bigger. He was in the first congregation I served. He was,
I remember.
yeah, he was such a nice guy and an older fella. And he and his wife Grace had gotten into an awful automobile accident where they should have died, really, but they made it through it amazingly. And then some years later, after I had left that church, I got a call informing me that he was dying. And I went to visit him at the hospital. And I had heard that he had not been speaking to anyone in days. And I walked in, and his wife, Grace, was there. And I started talking to her. And all of a sudden, he says, "Is that Mike?" and and I just thought, and you know, he didn't speak many more words after that. And I don't think it was necessarily that it was his memory of me as much as it was his memory of the music he experienced while I was at that church. And
Mm.
I hope I never forget that story because it reminds me of how closely connected we can become through music.
We become family.
Right. Well, there is just before my last concert with the Bainbridge Chorale, a music therapist in the group came to me and said, "You know, when we sing, endorphins are released and the trust hormone is released." And I thought that was
Wow.
such an interesting thing to know, and I think it's certainly true. Well, I have one last question for you.
I have one last answer.
All right. Well, so we're in this very unique time. What is one wish you might have for your singers or for your congregation um, during this time?
Well, you know, we've all, again, I alluded to this earlier. We've all experienced tough times before. Maybe not something quite like this, but we all experience suffering. And I do not believe that God causes our suffering or painful things to happen to us in life. But in the midst of these situations, it is a chance for our faith to grow, because faith grows in these when it's tested. You know, again, not God is not testing it, but the situation is testing our faith.
Yeah.
And as we have to remind ourselves that God has been faithful before to us, sometimes in the big things and sometimes in the small things. And so during this time, to learn how to have faith that the sun will shine again, that things will be okay. It may not be exactly the way it was, but when we get on the other side of this, and then we experience little bumps in the road, we'll be able to sail right over those because we know that God has been faithful in the big things and that God will be faithful in the little things. And that kind of faith is contagious, this faith that leads to hope. And so I hope that's what we have, is that we have a growth in our faith that leads to a hopeful society. Because I think we need hope these days for a lot of different reasons.
Right. And, you know, I think when it comes to faith, we don't rely on it in the good times necessarily. No. You know, we take it for granted.
Read the Old Testament.
Right. But I definitely think that when you look at growing in our faith in a very real way, we've been training our whole lives for something like this.
Sure.
Where we can actually really trust God to carry us through these difficult times.
And we're also finding new ways to serve. I mean,
yes.
I never thought I'd be doing these Zoom interviews and things, you know. I'd never done a Zoom anything before this hit. And in the midst of this trial, we will find a way as a church to be faithful, to be servants, to continue to check on people, and to be loving. Love will continue to find a way if you're open to it. I think that's another important lesson too.
Yes, yes.
Be open.
Well, Kevin, I thank you for your time. You know how much I value you and love you, and I'm just grateful that we could share this together. And I think this will be something folks will enjoy watching and thinking about. So thank you so much.
No problem. I hope we can look back on this when we're 100 and think, gosh, look how young those two guys look. They only had a little gray in their hair.
Well, I'm not going to get any younger from here, I don't think. So,
okay. I
Well,
enjoyed
look,
it, Mike.
I did too. Take care.